So in the previous video, we saw how to create a custom Java activity and use it inside the process. Now we are going to see how to create another type of Java object that you can create. It's actually a custom REST API. So exactly like we did for our activity, we are going to create a new class. So it's going to be here. I'm going to use IntelliJ ID, like I said, because I have a license for it. You can use any Java IDE like Eclipse, for example, or IntelliJ ID Community Edition, which is free. Just be sure that when you are building your code, that the path to the SDK folder is pointing to the right SDK, which is here in our case 2105. So let's see how we can create our REST API. So we are going to create a class. I'm going to call it sample REST. And here I got my class. And my class, like we implemented service before, we are going to implement RESTful resource from BMC. So now we can define our REST API. But for that, of course, we need to define what is the root path of our API. So if you are used to creating REST API in Java, that shouldn't be a big surprise. So we are going to define our main path, which is going to be sample app. And now we are going to create the REST APIs themselves. So you can create a post API, get API, delete API. I mean, you can pretty much create what you want, but here in our use case, we are just going to create a sample get call. So our get call needs a path, and the path here is going to be username and with a username. So here it's not really hello world, and we need the parameter which is username. After that, we need to tell who is going to be able to access this REST API. So for that, you have a couple of annotations that are very interesting. So I'm just going to paste them and explain what they do. So we have the transactional in case you are going to modify some data. And the best part, the most interesting part, is the access control method, and which is going to tell who can access this REST API. So here is just a valid user, but you could have something else. So by the way, in order to access this REST API, the user will need to be authenticated, which means that someone that is anonymous, or I don't know, if you want to consume it from a third-party website, you will need to get a JOT token first in order to consume any REST API from BMC. So here we have a path, we have our who can access this method. So now we need to tell what does it do, what does it produce. So the best practice is to just return a JSON, which should be this one. I know that, for example, you could return HTML, XML, whatever. The best practice is just return JSON, because that's what Innovation Studio can handle out of the box, and usually it's way easier in the UI later if you are using a view component to consume your REST call, to just use it. So by the way, when I said that in order to access this REST API, you will need a JOT token, of course, if you consume this REST API from an Innovation Studio view component, you don't need to do anything because you're already authenticated, of course. So now I'm going to create my method. I'm going to call it hello world. So let's see, it could return the sample object we created earlier. So the sample object, for reference, is just a class, simple class with two members, two properties, and with just some getters and setters that we used in the custom activity earlier in the previous tutorial. So here it's going to return sample object. I'm going to call it hello world. So now it's going to return sample object, new sample object. I'm going to create a sample object, so I don't need this. And I'm going to return the sample object. Because I'm lazy, I'm just going to copy the code that we saw earlier. That is just going to take the username and setting the username and the welcome message. So I'm going to do just this. We don't know what is username yet, but that's fine. We'll see that later. So I create my object, I return my object, and we can see here that we have one input parameter. So let's see how we can access that. So in order to access the input parameter, pretty much like in activity, we had something here with an annotation. So we need to use at path param. We need to give the name. So here it's going to be, the name needs to match username, and we need to tell what type it is. So it's a string, and the name is username. So let's do this. Okay, so now my REST code is generated, but the question is, how do I access this REST code, right? What is the path? So the path is going to be something like this. So HTTP, the Innovation Studio, the port /API, then it's going to be your bundle name. So here it's going to become example sample app. Then it's going to be the main path. Then it's going to be the REST API path. And here, of course, we need username. So if you want to use this REST API from a third-party website, that's the URL you're looking for. Of course, that's from third-party. Third-party website or Java code. And if you are consuming from Innovation Studio, of course you don't really need to give the full path. It could be just something like this. If you want to consume it from a view component, for example. So let's see. So it returned the sample object. Now that we have a REST API, we need to declare it like we did for the activity. So it's going to be in myapplication.java. And for that, we have something like we have from register service. Here we have REST API. So we have a register. That should be RESTful something, yeah. New, and it's going to be the class name. Okay, so here it should be declared. So let's build and deploy the bundle, and I will pause the video and I will resume it when it's done. Okay, so now the bundle has been built and deployed. And let's try to build our URL. So it's going to be in our case something like HTTP. Let's just copy this. 8008. So let's try to see what happens when we do something like that and just paste it inside a web browser. So here you can see that it returns the object, welcome message, and the username. If we try again in network, you can see that we have the call to our REST API, and the response is Okay, so let's refresh to see what happened. Okay, so let's refresh to see what happened. So here we have our call to the REST API we created. And here is the answer, which is a JSON object. And it returns with application JSON. So everything seems to be working perfectly fine. So now let's see how we can debug this information. So like we did for to debug the activity, so we need to be sure to have a configuration which is remote JVM debug. So here we have a specific entry for IntelliJ ID. So you need to pass the IP or the domain from your Innovation Studio server to the port 12444. It's going to attach to remote JVM. So this is for IntelliJ ID, and it would be something a bit different for Eclipse, but pretty much the same. I think it's remote server in Eclipse. So once we are done with that, we can just debug on the configuration. So here you can see that it attached very quickly. With Eclipse it takes more time because it tries to synchronize all the threads, so it's just way slower with Eclipse, last time I checked, and it's much faster with IntelliJ. So here I set a breakpoint. So of course I can just refresh, and you can see here it's blinking, like here the code is in progress. You can see it's still pending. And here I can see the value of my input parameter, and here you can see all the threads, right? But we are only interested in the main thread. So here I can just release, and here we go. Here we got the answer from our REST API, which is of course the same. But that's consumption from Innovation Studio, right? So let's see how we can consume this REST API from a third-party website, from third-party Java code, for example. So we are going to use Postman for that. So like I said, here this is just an example. Here is my login request, and we'll see that a bit later. And here is one code that was for another REST API. In our case, we just want this one. So let's see what happened when I put this one. You can see I got my hello Amelie and Amelie back. But it's because I have a cookie, right? So let's see what happens when I remove this cookie. So here I don't have a cookie anymore. And here it tells me that the authentication has failed because I don't have anything, right? I mean, when you're consuming from another Java code, of course you don't have a cookie, you don't have any authentication information, so the server doesn't know who is trying to consume this resource. So we just say authentication is failed. So what can you do about it? So you can create a login request. So you can use this REST API, API RX authentication login request. It needs to be a JSON. You need to pass the username and the password. And very important, you need to set X requested by header, request header, to any value, something like X, for example. For any resource that is not get, so any resource that modifies data, you need to pass X requested by with a value in the request header. So here I have a JOT token that I'm going to copy. And here you can see that you have two ways to pass values. So the first way is by default, you can see that the value is set automatically in the cookie because Postman is smart. So you can say cookie with a value AR-DWT equal and your token, something like this. So that's the first way you can do that, and you can do that in your Java code as well if you want to, but if you don't want to set the cookie, so let's remove the cookie. So here it's not working anymore. What you can do is that you can set the authorization request header, and this time you put AR-DWT, you don't put equal, you just put a space, and after the space you put your JOT token. and here it's working. So you have two ways to leverage this authentication token. The first one is using cookie, the second one is just using authorization.